Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the darkest Trek of all? Well, if you said Into Darkness, that's not a bad guess, but Into Darkness is too much of a jumbled mess to make any kind of coherent thematic point about anything, like much of the dark, edgy retreads of franchises we've gotten used to for the past 20 years. Kind of horrifying to think in another couple of decades after tumbling down the fascist rabbit hole, people will probably look back at American cinema from this era and think, wow, that stuff was so tame. But back to my question, which is the darkest Trek of all? Well, you probably guessed from the title, it's The Wrath of Khan from 1982. And it was done in such an entertaining way that I suspect many never really thought about what Wrath of Khan was actually saying about that American brand of Kennedy-era liberal optimism that Star Trek was known for. Part of this had to do with the vision of director Nicholas Meyer, who admitted in interviews he never really watched the series, and having to do so in taking on the job had the main takeaway that Star Trek was about what he called gunboat diplomacy. Meyer saw Trek, despite its loftier narrative ideals, as a militaristic franchise at heart, and The Wrath of Khan was shaped with this in mind, to the horror of Gene Roddenberry, who thought the militarism, violence, and dark tone of the film were going to be a little too much. Roddenberry had no idea how bad it was going to get in another couple of decades, but in 1982 the film was like a breath of fresh air, for a couple of reasons. One was it felt more in line with the creative lower-budget action of the show, especially compared to the dull, multi-million-dollar special effects gasm of the previous film. Two, it presented Admiral Kirk as a man going through midlife crisis, which felt true to William Shatner as a performer, and it was a side of the character ripe for exploration. Third, you had a ripped Ricardo Montalban, yep, they're real, reprising a perhaps less than memorable villain role from the series and hitting it out of the park, and it felt right for him as an actor too. After years of playing Mr. Rourke on Fantasy Island, Montalban was clearly enjoying himself playing a brutal bad guy, and you can't help rooting for him as Khan. And therein lies the problem. You see, Captain Kirk isn't just a guy in midlife crisis in Wrath of Khan, he's a literal mess, a failure on every level. Not just as a character, but as the main arbiter of the idealism and philosophy of Star Trek. So we're going to be getting into some granular detail about how Kirk blows it in this film. At the beginning of the film, Kirk seems like he's really out of touch with himself and his legacy as a starship captain. It's his birthday, he's not happy about getting older, and he's snippy with Saavik and his former crew. And it's Dr. McCoy who has to point out to him that he's languishing in his new role as a bureaucrat and needs to get back into the captain's chair before old age really takes its toll on him. As we soon discover, he's not just out of touch with his ambition and sense of purpose, he's also out of touch with his own feelings. We find out in Wrath of Khan that Kirk had a true love, Dr. Carol Marcus. And I should point out that Kirk is a character who's often mislabeled as a ladies' man, but careful inspection of the original series reveals that despite Kirk's penchant for using seduction or being seduced, there were only a couple of women that Kirk was ever actually interested in. Notably the mysterious Ruth, seen in the episode Shore Leave, and Edith Keeler from The City on the Edge of Forever, penned by the legendary Harlan Ellison. But in Wrath of Khan it's made clear that Carol Marcus was the one, the woman whom he almost settled down with, but didn't. Worse, she bore a son by him that he doesn't even know existed. The point being, we are being shown a Kirk in Wrath of Khan that doesn't seem to know what the point of his time in Starfleet was for, and he abandoned true love for the same career he now questions. Professional failure and romantic failure. The whole package. And no scene drives home just how badly he's doing than the hijacked Reliant's first attack. Throwing caution to the wind and oblivious to the fact that the loss of communications with Regula and Reliant might be connected, he ignores regulations, leaving the Enterprise's shields down while letting Reliant close to striking distance and deal crippling damage to the engineering section, causing massive injury to the terrified trainees and the death of none other than Scotty's nephew, Peter Preston. Not some random redshirt, but a young trainee who Scotty and the rest of the old crew are supposed to be looking after. This isn't just bad, it's humiliating and emblematic of everything Kirk is doing wrong. It's why Scotty brings his body straight to the bridge instead of the sickbay. He's saying to Kirk, look at what you did. But it gets worse. Kirk now continues to pursue Khan in a crippled ship with a trainee crew who are clearly not ready for combat. In any navy, on any ship, this would be an insane choice, yet he's enabled by Spock and the rest of the original crew who seem incapable of pointing out what a terrible idea this is. The story logic at this point seems to be, Kirk said they were the only ship in the quadrant, therefore they must pursue Khan. So let's deconstruct this argument. Kirk's statement would only make sense if the quadrant in question was the Beta Quadrant, which is mostly taken up with the Klingon and Romulan empires. I'm not sure why that's where they're taking their training crews, but whatever. They couldn't be the only ship in the Alpha Quadrant because that's where the Federation is. All the ships in Starfleet are right over here. There's no reason Kirk can't turn back and call for help at this point. The logical thing to do after this first encounter would be to turn back and call for help. Kirk and all the senior officers' first priority should be for the safety of the trainees. If no one's looking out for them, what's their purpose in this story anyway? You see, in a war movie, young people die because that's the nature of war and war propaganda. Young people are innocent and inexperienced, they go to war, they die, and you feel bad for them. But Wrath of Khan is not a war movie, so why are the trainees there? The only answer that makes sense in storytelling terms is that they are a reminder that Kirk and his original crew are old, that they are moving on, which would make sense if they were going to have the trainees playing a more active role in the story, which seems to have been the original intent. But that's not what ends up happening, because Wrath of Khan is trying to reboot an original crew film franchise, so they're not moving on. The end result is that the importance of the trainees being there is constantly diminished in this film. They're just there for scenery, and the film seems to want us to accept what's going on in war movie terms and forget the ethical responsibility Kirk and Spock and everyone has for protecting them. They should call for backup, report their Reliant hijacked, and get the hell out of there. Continuing on to Regula is a really bad idea. Speaking of bad ideas, why is Starfleet building the Genesis device right on the Klingon border? This would be like the US building the first atomic bomb in Mongolia. So we finally get to Regula, too late of course to save most of the scientists who get massacred by Khan because Kirk decides Warp 5 is fine despite the fact that, again, Regula going dark would be a lot like losing all contact with Alamogordo during the building of the atom bomb. At Regula, Kirk is reunited with Carol Marcus and the son he didn't know about who clearly isn't impressed with him. And now we arrive at perhaps the film's finest moment, where Kirk dishes on his life and choices, wondering about the road less traveled and rightly feeling like a failure. It's a great scene and probably Shatner's finest bit of acting, but here it is again, in the midst of a crisis where he's acted improperly and cost the lives of young people who look up to him. He's sitting here feeling sorry for himself, self-absorbed and toxic. And it still gets worse. Khan ends up finally detonating the Genesis device and Spock dies saving the Enterprise, and only then, finally, after years of imposing Starfleet ideals on countless planets, does Kirk finally seem to get it, that his choices have consequences, that the choice to have never checked up on Khan has consequences. All we're left with at the end is Kirk and crew staring at the Genesis planet and Kirk making a half-hearted speech about feeling young, a further kick in the teeth to the trainees who have to listen to this self-absorbed crap after nearly being killed by him. Where's Trek's optimistic tone and liberal message? Well, it's gone, actually. We're left to conclude that all that high-minded rhetoric Kirk was known for was, in the end, just a lot of big talk. And Khan knows this better than anyone. And let's talk about Khan for a minute. Here's a guy who knows what he is and what he's about. A brutal dictator foiled by Kirk and exiled to a doomed planet with his crew and wife. Say her name.
What's her name? McGivers?
Lieutenant MacGyvers.
It's Marla MacGyvers. And unlike Kirk, Khan loved the hell out of his wife. You have to consider he married her after she betrayed him. That's forgiveness. That's true love. And he has every right to want to avenge her death and stick it to Kirk. There are no cracks in his character whatsoever. Wrath earned. And the target of his wrath is shown in the end to be a broken guy who blew off love and family in favor of a career and liberal ideas that ultimately don't seem to mean much to him. Khan succeeds. He steals Genesis, blows it up, and kills the one person who actually mattered to Kirk. Khan is the hero of this film. Kirk and his role as the arbiter of Star Trek's idealism and philosophy have been completely upended. And I honestly have nothing upbeat to say about any of this. Wrath of Khan is the darkest Trek of all. This is Random Rob. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.